Are we live?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the Locating Orphaned and Abandoned Wells in Western Pennsylvania webinar. I'm Patrice Tomcik, and I will be your host today. We will record this presentation portion of today's webinar, but not the question and answer session at the end. We really encourage questions, and if you would like to ask a question, please put that in the question and answer function that you can find on your at the bottom, or you can also indicate that you want to ask a question verbally, and we can unmute you at the end. So thank you for that. I would like to introduce myself. I'm the National Field Director for Moms Clean Air Force, and I support community engagement on this project that we'll be talking about today. We have three speakers that will explain the project today, and they'll share some exciting information and updates. Our first speaker will be Adam Peltz, who is a director and senior attorney at EDF, focused on subsurface energy issues, with a special focus on orphaned and abandoned wells nationally, and in particular here in Pennsylvania. Our next speaker will be Don Hegburg, who is a program manager and professional geologist for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, Office of Oil and Gas Management, Subsurface Planning and Development. Don is responsible for the development of regulations, policy and guidance for subsurface activities associated with the oil and gas development in Pennsylvania. Don oversees the planning for well plugging and reclamation activities in the state. Our third speaker will be Meg Coleman, and she is the policy manager and is a geologist at the Environmental Defense Fund, who is one of the technical leads managing this project. So now I'd like to turn this over to Adam.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrice. And can we go to the next slide? So thanks again for everyone joining us today to get an update on our project of finding undocumented orphan wells throughout Western Pennsylvania. So this is a collaborative project, and we're looking to develop and expand upon various methodologies for finding undocumented orphan and abandoned wells in order to create a blueprint for Pennsylvania to take these technologies and techniques broadly across the Commonwealth. The main components, the main technical components of our work are drone flights in rural northwestern Pennsylvania that using magnetometers to detect the metal casings in wells, and then in urban southwest Pennsylvania using ground-based methane sensors mounted to cars and magnetometers in backpacks to walk the sidewalks in residential areas, and then working directly with landowners to report undocumented orphan wells that they know about to the PADEP, and finally to test a variety of methodologies for quantifying methane emissions from these wells. Our project partners include, there's us at EDF, Moms Clean Air Force, the Department of Energy, especially the National Energy Technology Lab in Pittsburgh, the PADEP, and then several universities, including Harrisburg University, Indiana University of Pennsylvania, Penn State Extension, and McGill University. Next slide. So why do we care about undocumented orphan wells? These are wells that are no longer producing, have no solvent owner of record, but have not been plugged. So these are open wells across the state, some of them dating back to the mid-1800s, beginning with the Drake well, not the Drake well itself, but from that era. Pennsylvania has as many as 700,000 orphan wells, mostly in the western part of the state, and you can see from this map basically where they're located. Only around 30,000 of these wells have been documented, and that means that the vast majority aren't on any maps and are not in a Pennsylvania DEP database, and thus are not in line to get plugged. And the reason why we care about these wells is because they are a public safety, environmental, and economic hazard. They can contaminate groundwater, emit air toxics and methane. Methane from these wells can migrate into structures and cause explosions, which have happened in the Commonwealth and surrounding region far too often. Their presence lowers property values. A study from University of Pittsburgh found that the presence of orphan wells reduces local building activity by 50%. And they render the subsurface uneconomic for other uses, whether that's additional oil and gas development, carbon sequestration, geothermal, and the like. Next slide. So what's happening now is, this issue has been kind of longstanding in Pennsylvania, and there has not been a lot of money to deal with it historically. But since the passage of the Infrastructure Act in 2021, huge new funds have been mobilized towards Pennsylvania to deal with this problem. Pennsylvania is in line to get $400 million altogether to plug down these wells. I believe something like 200 to 300 wells have been plugged using this funding so far, and Don will talk about that a little bit more later. But the true need in Pennsylvania to plug this well population is probably in the billions and maybe even in the tens of billions. In order to ever get to that level of ambition in funding, it's critical to actually go out and find these wells and put them on a map so that Pennsylvania can go to Congress and say, hey, thank you so much for the money that you've sent us so far. We've plugged these wells. It's benefited communities and it's benefited workers, but we have all these other wells that need to be plugged. And unless we go out and actually find them and put them on a map just like this one, that if it had all of the orphan wells, you'd barely be able to see any other western part of the state because there's just so many. Then you can go and get additional money to do this work, and the money flows. The vast majority of it goes directly to oil field service companies and their workers in the regions where the wells are found. People are getting paid six figures now to plug wells, and they're able to do it in their communities and go home at night to their families instead of being out on a job for 2 weeks. And so the more wells we can find, the more money we can get, and the more the historic oil patch in Pennsylvania benefits. And before we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight this map. This shows a prioritization ranking for the wells that are currently in the database. The red wells are those within 200 feet of a building structure, and the yellow wells are within 100 feet of waterways. So you could see that these wells pose significant risk to people living nearby in sensitive ecosystem receptors, and so we've got to get to them. Next slide. So we realized that in addition to the technical challenges of this project, it was extremely important to do stakeholder outreach to make sure that people understood what we were doing and why, especially in the areas where we were, in fact, flying drones, so that no one would be surprised and that residents who didn't want us to do the work could opt out. So we started last summer by reaching out to local, state, and national elected officials to share our plans. We sent letters to all of the 160 parcel owners in our Northwest Pennsylvania survey area in Clarion, Venango, and McKean counties, several rounds of those letters with an option to opt out for those who didn't want to participate. And our opt-out rate was around 10 or 15%. And then in mid-September, we held a series of open houses for landowners in Titusville, in fact, at the Drake Well Museum, in Foxburg, in Clarion County, and in Smethport in McKean County, where we brought the drone and had the drone operator, and everyone had the opportunity to learn about what we were doing and why, and ask their questions. And all of those events were quite successful, and we had really good interaction with people in the area and other interested residents and oil and gas operators and pluggers and the like. In October, we invited local press to see our launch of the drone in Gameland 72, and I'll show you a slide on that in a moment. We also notified the local police, the state troopers in all of the areas to make sure they knew what we were doing in case they got any calls. And we also did outreach to local news, and there was press coverage of the work in the Derrick and Clarion News and the Olean Times Herald. Next slide. This just gives you a sense of what the drone looks like. We wanted to do this as a video, but video and PowerPoints over Zoom never really work. So we got these screen grabs. So the drone is fairly large, kind of the size of a desk. And what's hanging underneath it at the bottom, you could see in the bottom of both of these pictures, is the magnetometer instrument itself. And so what that's looking for, metal signatures in the ground. And vertical well casings have a particular signature that's actually pretty easy to pick up. So we were flying these drones around 100 to 125 feet above the ground. The idea is to get over the tree line, because obviously you don't want to tangle the drones and the instrumentation up in the trees. If you go too high up, you can't get the magnetic signature. So 100 to 125 feet was a pretty good elevation to be able to detect what we wanted to see. Next slide. So this is an example of what the magnetometry readout actually looks like. These are samples from Gameland 72. The yellow bullseyes indicate a likely well. The vertical wells have a unique signature that are different from if it had been let's say a horizontal pipe, or some metal junk like an old car or something like that would show up differently. The upshot is, in the 8 square miles we were able to survey so far in Clarion and McKean counties, we found 250 likely orphan wells, which if that density holds across the western third of Pennsylvania, would in fact equal the high end of the estimate of 700,000 wells. So they're definitely out there, and you could definitely find them this way. Next slide. The next few slides show you where we did the work and what the readouts look like, and some additional information. So what you're seeing here on the left is in the green splotch shows where Gameland 72 is located in Clarion County. And then on the right, you can see where there's blue and green and purple background. That's where we actually were able to fly the drones. And all of these, the red dot and the purple diamond and that sort of thing, those are all wells, some of which were from our magnetic findings, and some of which were from old farm maps. And there's dots for USGS topo maps. And so these maps were created by the National Energy Technology Lab using multiple data sets in order to get a sense of where all these wells are that we know about in a variety of data sets. And the idea is that no one way of finding these wells is going to tell you everything. But if you combine all the data sets that we have and put them together, you can actually get a pretty good picture. So I'll show you over the next few slides the other places where we've flown. Next slide. So the primary the primary flights were in Clarion County in this parcel. You could see on the left side an outline of Clarion County and the townships, and then there's a blue area in the western part near Foxburg where we did the flyovers. In the green, you could see how we divided up the different parcels for different flights and different crews of what could be done in a day. And then on the right is where we actually flew. And so there's areas we didn't fly because people opted out, and there's areas we didn't fly because we had access difficulties. We need to have a line of sight to the drones, and if there wasn't a public road or a private road we could get access to, we weren't able to fly. But you could see that we have these what I'll call these nettle fusion maps for all of the areas where we could see both what we have found through our magnetometry work and what was already out there in various databases. Next slide. This is the equivalent in McKean County. You could see the areas in the southern, south central part of McKean County. McKean County alone could have 100,000 wellbores in it. And so there's a lot of work to do here. And the green shows a subset of this blue area that includes the opt-outs, and you could see where we actually flew and the fusion map on the right. Next slide. I'm now going to hand it over to Don Hegburg at the DEP to share what the state's next steps are on this part of the work. And over to you, Don. Thank you so much. No, you're on mute.
Thank you, Adam. So my name is Don Hegburg. I'm a geologist and program manager with the PADEP Office of Oil and Gas Management, Subsurface Planning and Development. And I am responsible for the planning associated with the plugging activities underway under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the federal funding. I've worked at DEP for over 35 years, overseeing environmental incidents, and have encountered being in orphan wells throughout my career. Actually live in Clarion, and a lot of that's been in the Northwest PA and Southwest PA. A lot of the incidents involved complaints from people who smell something in their building or taste something in their water that ends up being oil and gas related, or a stray gas situation with methane migration. Also in industry with oil and gas companies encountering abandoned wells through communication events during drilling new wells, as well as mining companies. So it's a problem that affects everybody. We currently have received about 100 million of the 400 million in federal funding, and have been plugging wells since early 2022 with that money. We have plugged over 200 wells with these federal funds. And as Adam mentioned, we do have about 30,000 documented orphaned and abandoned wells in our database, but studies and records show anywhere from 300 to 700,000 out there. The reason for these large amount of wells is due part to the fact that oil and gas development began in the late 1800s in Pennsylvania, and hundreds of thousands of these wells were drilled before modern rules and regulations existed that would track that activity. And in order for us to responsibly manage these federal funds to flood wells, it's important that we locate and inspect as many undocumented wells as possible to make sure the ones that are posing a risk to human health and the environment are addressed. So this pilot work done by the Environmental Defense Fund will aid DEP in conducting similar work statewide. So upon receiving the information from EDF, DEP will conduct field inspections. And these inspections will include confirming the location and confirming that they are in fact abandoned or orphaned oil and gas wells, and confirming their location, conducting a environmental inspection to determine the environmental impacts such as potential for groundwater, surface water contamination, or methane migration. Additional desktop review, we will do a determination to see if there is a responsible owner, operator of that well. We'll do a larger receptor survey to see if there's any nearby threatened or endangered species, cultural resource areas, and other things. And then at that point, we will score and rank these wells to incorporate into our database to decide if some corrective action needs to take place. I do want to note that we are going to contact landowners in advance of those inspections. Next slide, please. So just a couple examples of what we see and what we will do. We will inspect the wells. You're seeing a well that's not uncommon if you live in Venango, McKean, Warren. You may have seen a old oil well in a stream. We do find that. We will inspect these wells. We are using modern instrumentation to look for the presence of methane. You'll see in the middle, that's a laser type of instrument used to detect the presence of methane. And then again, if we do rank a well high enough to warrant corrective action, we will plug a well. And the picture on the right is an actual well we plugged in Erie County in a church. So we've been at this since 1989. We plugged 3,000 wells before federal funding, and it's really good that these funds are coming into Pennsylvania. And from there, you can move on, Adam.
Hey, thanks, Dawn. So I'm Meg Coleman. I'm with EDF, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the technical aspects of the project. Adam mentioned in the beginning that part of the objective for this project is to look at, compare and contrast different methodologies. And in one area where we're looking at that is in methane emissions quantification in the Northwest Pennsylvania areas that we're looking at. So in this slide here, there's three different techniques that are illustrated. On the left, this is Natalie Penkney from NETL using what's called a high flow sampler methodology to measure emissions from an orphan well. So this is currently, all these methodologies are under development, but this is one that's being looked at as perhaps the most cost-effective way of quantifying emissions from large numbers of orphan wells like we have in Pennsylvania. And it's a technique that's being used, I think, fairly widely across states where state agencies and researchers are trying to get a handle on the amount of emissions from these wells. To the right of that is a different method, which is called tenting. And that's much more accurate, actually, than the high flow sampler, but much more labor intensive and expensive to employ. So for this project, we're going to do a combination. We're going to try to measure a high number of the wells that we're finding using the high flow sampler methodology. And then we're going to measure a subset of those wells that we've measured with the high flow sampler with this more accurate tenting. And folks from McGill University and some of the EDF scientists are going to be using the tenting technique. And then we'll really be able to compare these two methods and get a sense of how accurate the high flow sampler methodology is. And then on the right is a third technique, which we're not employing in this project, but it's something that might be useful for long-term monitoring of orphan wells once they're discovered. It's OGI, which stands for Optical Gas Imaging Camera, and it's mostly used as sort of a cost-effective mass deployment solution for for fugitive emission detection. So emphasis on detection rather than quantification. So it's a good alert system. You can set these cameras up and as sort of a monitoring, and they'll pick up emissions, fugitive emissions again. So it's a good detection system. So again, it may be something that folks might consider for monitoring of wells that they already know are in existence, where they can set up these cameras and in a sort of monitoring array. Up in the right corner here is also a histogram, and what that's showing, and it's an important point to make, is that in terms of methane emissions from orphan wells, is it's quite variable. So this I guess shows kilograms of methane emitted per day on the vertical axis, and then on the horizontal axis are well numbers that were sampled in Hillman State Park in Pennsylvania. So you can see the amount of emissions from orphan wells can vary from very little emissions to fairly significant emissions, and can vary by well. We think it also can vary in terms of when the well is measured. So just to give you a sense of the variation. And so the methane quantification part of this project is intended not only to compare methodologies, but also to get a good sample set of emissions from orphan wells in Pennsylvania to try to get a better handle on how much methane is emitted en masse by these wells. Sorry, my dog is dreaming. I hope you can't hear that. But if you could go to the next slide. Okay. Another thing we wanted to mention is that in the northwest part of Pennsylvania, there are 3 different counties where we're intending to do these surveys. And so far, we've done surveys in Clarion County and McKean County, and we suspended operations before we got to Venango County when it got closer to hunting season. And when we realized that we were really encountering a lot of challenges in our drone operations due to both the tree canopy and the mountainous terrain. So what we're hoping to do in the spring is to go back to Venango County with a beyond visual line of sight waiver from the FAA, which we've applied for, and in which case it will make it easier for the drone operators to cover a larger area of that particular parcel. And so we don't know exactly when we'll be doing that in the spring, but that's the plan for continuing the work and expanding the area that we've surveyed in Northwest Pennsylvania. The parcel in Venango County is above an oil pool. The other 2 areas were above gas pools. So we're hoping to test these methodologies in a variety of both geologic and types of terrain. Okay, go to the next slide, please. Okay, so as most, if not all of you know, and as Don illustrated in some of his slides where they have been plugging wells inside of churches and buildings, orphan wells are not just in rural northwest Pennsylvania, but they're also in urban and suburban areas. And can not only be close to buildings, but can be underneath buildings and infrastructure. So this project, we're intending to not only test methods for finding orphan wells in rural areas, but also in these very challenging urban and suburban areas. So starting this spring, we're planning to continue the work in possibly these 3 areas that are highlighted on this map. So in Allegheny County, and 2 possible areas in Washington County. And actually, we recently spoke to folks at the Pennsylvania DEP who are also considering other areas that might even be higher priority. So these are potential areas on the table where we might do some work, and there may be some additional areas also that might take higher priority. So working in these areas, there's both advantages and disadvantages to trying to find orphan wells in urban areas, as you can imagine. I guess one of the advantages is there's lots of roads and sidewalks, and we're not going to try to do this work with drones with magnetometers mounted to those. Instead, we'll be mounting methane detection sensors on cars and driving around roads to initially try to find gas leaks that might indicate there's an orphan well. And then once we've got a sense of those sorts of surveys, then we're going to have we're also going to do magnetic surveys, but those magnetometers will be in backpacks that somebody will be wearing, walking along sidewalks in the areas where we think there's potentially orphan wells. And as in the Northwest Pennsylvania project, we'll also be doing extensive community and stakeholder outreach, similar to what Adam described that we did in Northwest Pennsylvania, and we'll do that well in advance of the surveys. And one thing that might be slightly different about the outreach that we would do in Southwest Pennsylvania is we would also probably include the gas utilities in case we did find gas leaks that might indicate leaks in the gas distribution systems. And we've also included in this slide for your reference just the amount of mileage that we think we can cover with road systems, state highway systems, and for doing these kinds of survey. And we're doing that kind of analysis right now to figure out what the cost would be before we put out requests for proposals for getting that kind of work done in those areas. So we look forward to doing that, and we'll be reaching out to those communities and stakeholders when we get closer to figuring out exactly what we'll be doing for that part of the project. Okay, next slide, please. And this next slide, this is sort of an exciting, fairly new development for this project. So sort of in addition to remote sensing and using these high-tech techniques for finding orphan wells, there's also a very effective old-fashioned technique for finding orphan wells, which is communicating with the landowners, who many of which know where a lot of the orphan wells are on their property or are also interested in finding them. So we're going to be working with Dan Brockett at Penn State Extension. He's going to be leading the work. Many of you probably already know him. He'll be holding a series of landowner workshops that will be geared towards finding undocumented orphan wells and reporting those during this next summer. He'll be working with student interns that will work with landowners to help them identify and report undocumented orphan wells on their property to the Department of Energy. And then the Department of, the DEP, it's not the department, actually, the Pennsylvania DEP. And the point being that the DEP will be able to then include these wells on their well plugging list. And part of the motivation that might help landowners become interested in this is we'll be funding a $100 bounty for each new undocumented orphan well that's undocumented so far, and that can then be cataloged in this way. So, and then another aspect of it is that the Penn State Extension will also be engaging with the DEP on figuring out ways to make it easier for landowners to report undocumented orphan wells. We know there's a lot out there that are not on the books, and definitely want to grease the wheels on that communication so we can really scale up and find all these orphan wells so that they can be plugged. Okay, next slide. And I think that concludes our information, and I'll turn it back over to Patrice.
All right, thank you, Meg, Dawn, and Adam. And on this slide, you can see some contact information. You can see about the orphan well projects that are happening, and you can visit that through Environmental Defense Fund's website here. And you can see that the website is edf.org/PAW. And you can also address questions at, you'll see the website there. And then reporting on orphan or abandoned well locations, there is the Pennsylvania DEP information. And if you know or want to be a part of the Penn State Extension project, you can see some of the information there that they have provided, and you can link to that. What we'd like to do is we'll go ahead and end the webinar recording, and we will switch to our question and answers. So if you want to go ahead and stop recording, please.